Hello, and welcome to the Crypto Science Society podcast, a show dedicated to the study of strange and unusual phenomenon. I am your host, Jason Cordova. With me today is Jene Conrad.
Hello, it's been a while.
It has been a while. Where have you been?
Oh, self-isolating, working from home.
That's right.
I work in education, so a semester's about to stop, so I get to kind of say goodbye to students for a little while, give them a break from all of this, plug away through the summer.
Yeah. Plug away. And speaking of plugs, I have to point out that this episode is brought to you by Monstroko brand bone meal. When you need your bone meal ground up, contact Monstroko. For more about Monstroko products and the world's premier paranormal preparedness podcast, listen to our friends over at Werewolf Radar.
Plugs are always so interesting to me.
Aren't they? They gave us one. We got to give it back.
So Jason, why are we here?
Why are we here? Well, it's all about how the dystopia is treating everybody, for better or worse. We've been under a pandemic for the past few months, which has contributed to the delay of the release of a new podcast, and hopefully won't delay us or put us back too much more. But surprisingly, I thought we'd have all kinds of time on our hands. Dystopia is a lot of work.
I'm going to talk about that for a quick moment because I know we have more interesting paranormal stuff to go talk about in terms of all this, but I think time is weird. I think this is really showing what a construct time is and how important physical objects in reality help us to capture time. Because it's I feel I can't separate work from life anymore. It's here's my desk, my bed is right next to me. So I think it's just the exhaustion of working online. Your brain's just working harder. So time is weird and goopy.
Yeah. Weird and goopy. Not wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's not quite as linear as we once thought it was. That is an interesting, that would be a totally interesting look into time as an observation, an observational study of time, and it's getting into quantum realities and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, well, and it'll tie into my parroting, quacking all the time about psychoreactive phenomenon. We'll get to that later.
Well, drink.
Yeah, but how about you? What have you been up to in the pandemic?
Well, pretty much balancing this idea of preparing for a zero-sum game versus participating in mutual aid, support, and sustainability projects. When it first hit, going to the grocery store was pretty much like playing zombie a video game. I was ready. I had my bandana and my machete on my hip for the first few days. And, that turned out not to be as practical.
I'm really grateful to my local grocery store because it's just less intense going there. And so it's if I have to give up my car eventually, which I think I'm going to prepare for that, right?
Right.
I can walk to it and it's nice, but I interrupted. So go ahead and go.
Enjoying gas being cheap. That's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, that's not going to last forever.
No, not going to last. Not going to last long. In fact, I think now that things have kind of shifted a little bit, it's coming back, kind of coming back up. But I wanted to point out this idea of the zero-sum game versus mutual aid support. And that's a concept that a lot of people may not be familiar with. If you're listening, the zero-sum game is basically the idea that there's one winner and everybody else loses, right? And with all this hoarding mentality that is influencing hoarding groceries, I literally saw at the store people were like pushing stuff off of the shelves into their cart. It's like raiding stuff, and it was just absolutely insane. And of course, that does a number of things. Like, it takes resources away from people who actually need it, and hoarding it, unless it keeps, it's going to go bad and it's going to get wasted. And it's not like there was a shortage of supplies. It's just a matter of people panic buying, and thinking, I have to have it all so that I can win, and not thinking about how everything else is going to affect other people, right?
Yeah, because I had some like battling between that too. It's like a bit of like the panic, because I was like, when this happened in like January, early February, I was like, oh shit. And then I was like, oh, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. And so kind of balancing was like, but at the same time, I was like, I couldn't afford to go to the store at the time, like especially when we were like asked to be like locked down. I was like, well, I'm kind of like out of my paycheck right now, so I kind of have to go to the store.
Right. Yeah.
So, and it's really interesting, just sort of, and the people taking advantage of it too, like buying up all of the hand sanitizer and things like that, selling it really high. It really puts the most vulnerable people even in a more vulnerable predicament.
Absolutely. Right. Right. And so that's kind of why Savannah and I are more focusing on the, mutual aid support, sustainability kind of side of things. We've been working in the garden. We made our own hand sanitizer. We made our own soap. We got chickens. We're like,
yeah, look at you. I have not been doing that, but I also I rent, and so it's like I can't really. I do have my backdoor neighbor can compost and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like I don't know. That might be a good thing to plug if you know of it. And we probably should have looked this up. In terms of mutual aid, food pantries are really needing food. So if you are hoarding, you may share some of that a little bit, please.
If you've got it, obviously we're at this point where you can see, where things are going. So kind of have a better idea of what you can get a hold of and maybe what you can share. So yeah.
Because I was reading an article, we're at like a 14%, or was that just Colorado? That feels really high, but I think that's the number. Don't quote me on that. But I think we've had like the worst employment rate since the Great Depression.
Oh yeah. I think according to the news this morning, like a quarter of the workforce is unemployed.
Yeah.
And I'm one of them. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, and I'm going on a tangent, I'll come back and then we'll go to the next thing. But like I was thinking of the Spanish flu and its potential relationship to the Great Depression.
Yeah. That's an interesting point, and I'm sure somebody's looking into that.
So let's hope that we don't end up like Hoover or worse.
Yeah. Well, Trump versus Hoover?
Yeah. Should we get more into our disclaimer before we get more into the podcast?
Oh, well, all right.
Because I think it's really important. I know that and we can go back to like the dystopian trading stuff. One of the biggest things, like whoever is listening, since we are probably going to talk about conspiracy cryptids, a lot of really interesting disclosures that have been happening, like a lot of crap's going down. Especially with this podcast, I want to be very mindful, like we do take this, it's real, it's happening.
As in, to clarify, the coronavirus.
The coronavirus.
The global pandemic.
Is real.
Is real. It is an actual threat.
It's
that
not
is not been invented.
I do think that people are taking advantage of it. We could talk about conspiracies in those realms, and I'm definitely going to talk about some people that are popping up that are taking advantage of the situation. Yeah. But I really think it's really, really dangerous to spread misinformation.
Absolutely. Right. And that's kind of a big point of why we wanted to get on and talk about it, is because there is so much weird nonsense stuff. I'm kind of a hub, like people send their conspiracy theories to me, want to get my take on it and my talk on it. So like, here it is.
Yeah. I think when it's time to talk about the psychological aspect of it, but I just it's real. So social distancing is showing to work, staying at home as much as possible, wearing your mask when you're out in public. I know some, I don't walk with it when I'm on a trail, but
right around people. When I see the people, it's like when you're driving in the mountains at night and you got your brights on You don't need your brights when you see another person, so just turn those brights down. Come up on another person on the trail, put your mask up. Cover your face and nose.
Yeah. And then also too, especially if you're in Colorado, one of the biggest things that I think people aren't doing here is that like don't go into the high country. Like I know it's like, oh, the mountains will be safe in the mountains, but we have a lot of vulnerable populations in the high country.
Unless you're already there. The point
Unless
is,
you're already there.
stay
But like,
put.
but that's your home.
Right.
Because we've had some really intense outbreaks in the high country, and a lot of people don't think about mountain people and the socioeconomic class aspects of it and access in general.
Right. There's some urban isolationism.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I don't know,
But
just be mindful of that.
absolutely, yeah. And as a reminder, at least here in Colorado, we are under what's called a safer at home order by the governor, which includes like, yeah, there's a soft reopening, but that doesn't mean all bets are off, right? We're still recommended to only travel within 10 miles to recreate. And that means just pretty much don't go if you don't have to.
Yeah, and especially since like I have a person who still has to go to work and he works in an environment that's vulnerable since he works at CSU. There's people who are stuck in vulnerable situations who are being very mindful and very careful, and so follow suit.
Right. And this is the whole world, and everybody's listen to the science, listen to the research, and for better or worse, even if your government isn't taking it seriously, whichever politicians you're choosing to listen to and follow, maybe take a step back and evaluate the big picture. And hopefully we can help guide you to do some of your own research. That's the big polls of the Crypto Science Society has always been like, hey, if you don't like what we're saying, if you disagree, do some research and see what's there. Another thing, a point that we wanted to make was that, yeah, we're living in kind of a dystopia, right? And dystopia realities may look different to different groups throughout the world. And this is really nothing, this necessarily isn't entirely new to people in other parts of the world. And, it's not to diminish anything that we're experiencing here, because it is stressful and it is weird, it is bizarre and surreal. And it's also not going to be going away anytime soon. Like there's a new normal.
And we have a big opportunity to make something better out of this.
Absolutely, right? So with that in mind, there's a lot of feelings. There's a lot of strong feelings about what's happening and how it's affecting us. And even though Heather couldn't be with us to record today, we've been having a lot of conversations over this time and talking about kind of the psychic impact of what's happening, right? And I don't even feel like one has to be incredibly empathic or energetically sensitive to notice that things are weird, things are funky, right? I mean, unless you're a complete shill or like a shell of a human being and don't notice anything, or you're just blocking everything out, it's weird, right? Like, especially when it first all went down, you go out and there's a tension in the air, right? I could feel it increasing and decreasing in intensity. There's a lot of fear and just weird funkiness. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. And that kind of goes back to when we think of like paranormal imprinting, or like when we think of like ghost phenomenon in terms of like an echo that's left behind. It's kind of happening en masse right now. And so like certain stores you go on to, that there's like an intelligent emotion now, and you can kind of tell. Or I don't know, driving is not pleasant. I think people are kind of getting out a lot of their like fear and aggression on the road. I live up north in Colorado, and so I have like a really lovely trail next to me, next to a river. And so the other thing that's kind of nice is like that's the only place people have anymore. Mm-hmm. And so there's like a level of, you can kind of feel people breathe. You can kind of feel that energy of people getting outside. And so there's some of that too. Like the imprinting has been really an interesting sort of thing.
Yeah. Energy wise, I feel like being cooped up and kind of finding things near your place and just being in that area, right? I feel like things have settled down quite a bit, though. But also, I mean, I feel like things have settled down with that really initial, really funky, tense, like ugly kind of feelings. However, now there seems to be some kind of I don't know what you'd call it. It was like there was a lull, and now it's like pulling.
I think I know what you're saying, though, and maybe like this will help with the thoughts. Is one thing that I find really fascinating is the concept of sound and how sound impacts matter. Like we have a lot of studies about it, and now everything's been really quiet. And so it's strange and it's weird and it's tense, but there's less jets in the air, so there's less noise that way. There's less people moving about, there's less cars on the road, things like that. And so as we were all kind of staying home, there's this almost settled sort of quiet.
Yeah.
And now that it's kind of, and then the frenetic energy all of a sudden of people going out and hanging out, it just ramps up. So socialization is really different.
Sure. Yes. Also, there seems to be this surge of anger and frustration with people, mostly kind of coming from the right, that look like they're just, you're not going to tell me what to do, freedom to endanger everybody around me, and refusal to wear the masks, coming out and like shooting people when they're told to wear a mask or asked to wear a mask, and randomly ramping up this really aggressive, you can't tell me what to do kind of thing.
And that plays really in, especially right now, the conspiracy theory, especially in the last, I feel like 50 years of distrusting the government and like a lot of the paranormal sort of that happen around that. Like, I think it's really feeding into this. Like, I think people are really scared, and that's part of happening. People are really afraid of government control.
Right.
And then also just like not knowing how not to live without capitalism in many ways, because we're kind of being forced out of this capitalistic paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
And we're living in a time where things are radically shifting in a moment.
Right.
And how do you psychologically handle or deal with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and if you're not, that's an interesting point, because there are other parts of the world that are treating things differently, right? I haven't been hearing of a lot of anti-government protests from countries that are less dependent on capitalism, right? There seems to be kind of a particularly unique blend going on here in this country. And if you're not, if all of your media is coming from a kind of very controlled echo chamber, it's easy to not be exposed to kind of different views and different ways of doing things. So that also brings up this kind of question, as we mentioned before, of this the psychoreactive phenomenon, right? Which is always a thing. It's been rattling in my mind quite a bit lately. And this idea that it was on one of the other podcasts I listened to, they were talking about how the observational element of an event has an effect, right? So like the Harvard study where they used random number generators, and they did studies where people would be focusing on a particular thought or idea and tried to see whether or not it affected the random number generators. Mm-hmm. Well, and they determined like right after 9/11 hit, the random number generators started putting out specific patterns, right? And there was another thing. It was the, I forget his name, former Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau's dad. He was beloved Prime Minister. And when his funeral happened, they did a test in Canada to determine, like a comparative, if the random number generators in Canada would have a different outcome from the random number generators in the US, right? Across this border where Americans don't care about the Prime Minister, so they're not invested in the funeral. And so is their consciousness, is their attention affecting that result? And it appeared to have a correlation. So what is going on now under this pandemic? And, what does that even mean, right?
Yeah. Also, just to kind of go back real quick, I think it should be constitutionally illegal. If your parent was a prime minister, you should not be qualified.
Why?
Because I feel like it sets up a weird dynastic precedent.
All right. So now we're telling Canada how to do
I don't think Bush, I think the same thing about the US. I think parents should, that could play into some of my weird conspiracy theories
well,
about
I'll
that stuff.
come right out. Like, I think the Obama girls are going to grow up to be badass presidents. Just saying.
I don't think they should though, because their dad would. I know, but that's just like,
But
I
why?
think
Why? What grounds? That's a whole other podcast.
that's a whole other thing. But like, if we're
A
gonna
whole other thing.
go,
Whole other thing.
it's a whole other thing. I'm just saying, like, it sets a dynastic precedent.
Interesting. All right. Well,
Then it's just like royalty by proxy.
yeah. It's not always a bad thing.
So in terms of number generators, kind of like what
A benevolent dictator might be a better way to go.
wow, okay. No, thank you. That's an oxymoron.
Is it?
Yeah.
Benevolent dictatorship?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, we're getting way off track.
Yeah,
And
sorry.
I'm going to take a note of an editing note there. Okay. So you have a note in here about a spike in demonic violence and the effect of idle human consciousness.
That is actually Heather's point.
Oh, that's Heather's point.
Yeah.
Do you think it's talking about demonic violence or domestic violence?
I think it's probably domestic violence. I would assume. No, I think that's definitely more of her point. I think in terms of.
All right, let's skip over that then.
Yeah.
Okay, going on to, while we're on the topic of psychological influences and a certain degree of psychological warfare and a way to talk about different approaches and different governmental ideas culturally, I thought it was pretty interesting that Indonesia was deploying ghosts to frighten people into staying at home. This idea they had people dressing up as ghosts.
Oh, it was like wow. So it's like
yeah, right.
That's interesting.
Right, and of course Indonesia, they might have a different idea of ghosts and spirits in that way, and the idea was that they're probably like more of an old school kind of superstition approach. I don't mean a superstition. I mean a cultural.
Well, like a collective story.
A collective story, yes. So that this idea that seeing a ghost would impact a person into wanting to stay home, whether that is to influence them like, hey, if you go out, you might die, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like warning sign. Or also an idea of personifying the virus in a way to help drive it home, like this is real and this is something to be cautious of and mindful of, right? Unfortunately, it seems like it had kind of the opposite effect, though, because it had a lot of people coming out and wanting to take pictures and selfies with the ghosts.
That's interesting. In terms of kind of like the blend of the mystic in a lot of different cultures with science is an intriguing thing. A lot of times the way people relate to reality and different things like that are varied. And so that's like an important note.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting the different ways where everyone's reacting.
Yeah, we've been out of the game too long, so we're like, our flow is way off.
Yeah, it's okay. This is just practice. Well, it's not practice. We can collaborate together.
Yeah, right.
There's also just a crap ton to be said, because like in terms of a lot going on, and because of the pandemic, I think that there has been like really interesting releases of like disclosure things and people popping up, and so it's creating a really intense, chaotic environment in a really hard realm in order to disentangle like conspiracy and fact and science and experiences. And then also too, it's just we're in a powder keg ripe for like cult leaders and new religions. And so you're also seeing a lot of that pop up in a very radical way.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be some interesting implications, and like I think things are going to pop up that we just can't even predict. But your point of other things going on behind the scenes kind of thing is really a good thing to look at, right? Well, the news is just dominated with pandemic stuff. There's some other kind of interesting things. In case you missed it.
In case you missed it, there's all these things. And then also pay attention to what's happening in the Supreme Court right now, people.
Right? Pay attention to the Supreme Court. Like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff trying to get pushed through. But also, as far as UFOs are concerned, it's been kind of hot. UFOs have been, I don't know why, I don't know what's going on, but like right now, just before the stay-at-home orders were issued, Colorado had kind of an anomalous drone invasion. I don't want to go too deep into it, but we had, for a few weeks straight, there was this mysterious fleet of drones that were flying over on the Front Range, kind of Denver area, between Colorado Springs and Fort Collins area. Nobody knew where they were. Nobody knew who's operating them. So normally there's a specific radio frequency that drones operate under. So if they're being remotely piloted, you can kind of hack in and tap into the frequency they're using and help to track it down. Nobody could do that. The FAA weighed in on it. The police departments were weighing in. Nobody could find out who these drones were being operated by and why they were there. They came and went and disappeared, right? And it's still just up in the air mystery. So that's interesting. It's also important, I think it's interesting to note that there's been a surge in UFO sightings. In April specifically, MUFON reported 770 sightings that were submitted to MUFON, which is a mutual UFO network, for the US. So comparing that to the average of about 300 to 400 sightings per month in the US. That's quite a spike.
Yeah, which I think in terms of things like this, I feel like it is psychoreactive in some ways sometimes.
Yeah.
Because especially like when people are paranoid or worried or scared and stuff, we always look for something outside of us, you know?
Right.
And I think aliens is something that a lot of us like look to, either for comfort or fear, or life can't be random, so it must be these other things. But then also too, there's also some really fascinating, legitimate, odd sightings too. That's like, what does this mean?
Right.
And so it's really fascinating. And then also the disclosures that are occurring.
You mean the Pentagon UFO videos?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's pretty interesting too. And I think it's kind of interesting that they're doing it now, right? Like, why now of all times?
Well, I think there's many reasons for that.
Sure.
I think it comes down to, I feel like the conspiracy, we always have this kind of agreement. The conspiracy comes down to human incompetence a lot of times.
Right.
By the way, like, which reminds me is like, I keep thinking about the JFK assassination thing that left podcast. And I thought it was like, it was mind blowing to me because I kind of think about that in a lot of other scenarios and situations. And I think a lot of times, like releasing the Pentagon UFO videos, yes, it's like really interesting information, but I also think it's like, hey, please look at this right now.
Yeah.
Here you go. Like, fuels like a certain kind of mythology.
Uh-huh. So you're thinking that it's kind of like dropping it as a distraction from the pandemic debacle.
Not just the pandemic debacle, but for a lot of different reasons. Like, I do think that there are some smart people kind of taking advantage of situations. Like, I think that the pandemic is a really good spot of vulnerability to do certain things. Like, it's an opportunity to get certain shit done, either for good or bad, right?
Right.
And so I think it's also like, well, we've been meaning to like disclose this because we have certain laws that tell us about disclosure. So like, oh, we'll just. So a lot of people don't know about it. And then you have other people who like glom onto it really hardcore. And then we're forgetting about, hey, the Supreme Court is making a decision on DACA soon, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that can be really dangerous and interesting. But also, what it also does too is that it fuels a lot of like conspiracy theories who for years have been thinking like FEMA camps and calling the herd and, you know, like totalitarian government. And so it's fueling all these things that so many people have been thinking for decades in terms of conspiracy theories in our government, that it's also like this thing of like, okay, like in terms of our propaganda machine, dropping that as well, it's like distracting people on this side and this side.
Sure.
And creating like a.
But again, that raises the question of like either the hyper competent well-oiled machine, the propaganda machine, the military-industrial complex, as if like everything's homogenous and efficient and targeted, right?
Right. Well, I think it could be targeted without being efficient.
Maybe.
I mean, look at like how Russia interfered with our election and how elegant they've been able to do certain things.
Yes, fair. That's looking at kind of one element of kind of their intelligence apparatus, right? Whereas it seems kind of similarly, and this is kind of like the insider view from what we've been able to glean from, say, Lou Elizondo, John Alexander, Nick Pope, the folks who have like worked on the inside for government UFO and paranormal programs. And in this case in particular, with the Pentagon UFO, specifically the UFO videos, what they officially released as official, like this is basically the rubber stamp of approval that says these two videos, the Tic Tac video from the Nimitz incident in 2004, and then the gimbal video that was in Virginia. It took I forget the battle group or the ships involved with that one. But these are basically two Navy FLIR videos taken by fighter pilots. Gimbal was 2017, and the Tic Tac was 2004. It's pretty profound in that these pilots, highly competent, intelligent, trained observers, engaged with these objects, documented them on their FLIR videos, and the Pentagon acknowledged that these are real and that they are unidentified, right?
And that's anything, because an unidentified flying object it doesn't necessarily always mean aliens.
Right. It doesn't mean aliens, but it also kind of perplexes us because, these are trained observers and intelligence analysts who have determined that this is not something identifiable, right? This is something that moves beyond any known capabilities of any technology or intelligence that we are aware of, right? So yes, of course it is easy to jump to that conclusion of aliens, right? And honestly, I personally lean that direction, right? If we apply Occam's razor to it.
You can make Occam's razor for everything.
Right. I shave with Occam's razor.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, and so certain things, like when it feels so coincidental, it just plays into people's minds. And it's like, I get caught up in it too. Like I always have, like I give myself like 30, like now what I've had to do, because I'm a gullible motherfucker, is to give myself 30 minutes. Well, I guess maybe not so much anymore. I give myself 30 minutes to be like, what's the craziest, most outlandish story? And I don't mean crazy lightly, but like story I could possibly think of in terms of my incredible
mind run wild. Just go with it.
Go with it. And then I'm like, okay, take a breath. Let's go back. Like, let's look at the facts. Like, where does it lead to? Are there journal articles related to it? Have people studied it? And then usually comes somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah.
But what's interesting is the middle's still freaking weird.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think it's important to point out for our listeners too, people throw Occam's razor around quite a bit, right? This idea, it's not a mathematical concept. It's not a purely scientific concept. It's kind of just like a thought exercise,
right?
That indicates like, okay, probably the simplest explanation is probably the right one, right? And what is really weird to me, like it boggles my mind. I love Michio Kaku. I love Neil deGrasse Tyson. I love Bill Nye. I love all these science mind people. But when it comes to UFOs, they like to do logical gymnastics, like to try to discount it, right? Like, and I would be surprised if any of those guys actually sat down and looked into it any deeper than just like, oh, it's a video, and that could be anything, right? Like Tyson just posted something about it being, all the color photos, everybody's got a cell phone camera, and the best we can come up with is a shaky FLIR video. But these are Top Gun pilots. This is...
Well, and also, we have to think about,
you know?
you could use that same logic to say that we didn't land on the moon because we couldn't see stars in the background. We have to think about the environment in which we're taking those photos, in which we're filming, on what device, at what time. Sometimes I think because we're so highly technologically advanced in many ways, it gives us more of a precedent to be like, that's a hoax, or that's a thing, or that can't exist, or this isn't legitimate, without taking the time to really deconstruct what that technology is actually doing. Yeah, there's a lot of hoaxes. You can do a lot with technology. It's really fascinating. But technology also can pick up some really interesting anomalies that we just throw out the window because it doesn't fit. Right. In terms of like, okay, but that outlier, that anomaly is still interesting. Like, do we want to get lost in the weeds with it necessarily? Right. Maybe not. But taking a note of it and be like, okay, like, I'm the first one to be like really critical of kind of the way I think, since I do go off the rails sometimes. But then I was just like, okay, but that's still a weird piece of evidence. I don't know what it is. I know what it's not. But like what I don't know what it is part is still an intriguing piece of the equation.
Exactly, right? And I'll even give Michio Kaku credit, because he used to say, I don't know, I haven't heard him speak on it recently specifically, but he was like, you do that kind of hypothetical mathematical exercise of, even if we'll just even look at that 770 reported UFO sightings from MUFON over April. Let's say out of those, let's say that 10% of them are not easily identifiable objects, right? Mm-hmm. And we rule out, that comes down to, let's say, 7 of them, right? 7 or 8. 7 or 8 of those 700 sightings are legitimately anomalous, unidentifiable. We have no idea what they could be, right? Right. Even if one of them was, like, any one of those, 10% is really fascinating and creates a massive implications, right? Like, they have really profound implications if even one of those is legitimately anomalous. And here we have a really well-documented, verifiable, evidence-based situation where multiple trained witnesses, multiple radar targets, FLIR videos, documented, verifiable evidence, and going all the way up to the DoD, the Department of the Navy has reassessed their protocols for porting UFOs for pilots, right? So this isn't like a laugh factor. They're taking it seriously enough that, like, whatever it is that's operating in the skies with them is recognizable as something that needs to be taken seriously, and that they're allowing high-ranking pilots and officers to speak publicly on it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, Commander Fravor is not just some nobody, lowly ensign or lieutenant. He was the wing commander, and he's retired as a colonel. A commander. The commander in the Navy is like a lieutenant colonel in the Army. That's pretty lofty position, and to have the official sanction of the DoD to speak publicly on this event, right? Yeah, it happened 10 years ago, right? That's a pretty big deal, and it's not something to be scoffed at. Another interesting thing about that video, that set of videos too, is that it was already publicly released and sanctioned 2 years ago.
I'll go talk about my deep dive conspiracy comment sections in a bit, but I that's an interesting point you made, which I'll bring up later.
Yeah, I would recommend everybody. My cousin Alejandro did kind of a deep dive panel discussion with a few experts on the topic, and kind of broke down the why now kind of thing, and why it was released and how it was released and stuff. It goes a lot in the To the Stars Academy and Tom DeLonge and all that, but it's a really interesting topic, and I really recommend people get deeper into it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'll say stuff later with the conspiracy stuff.
Well, I don't want to get too deep, too off the rails with UFO stuff, because we've got rails to jump off of with the conspiracy stuff too.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to talk about a little bit, because you mentioned FEMA. And there is some legit shady stuff going on with FEMA.
Right. And that's where, like, the thing, and I'm interrupting again, side note, edit note, I don't mean to, I'm like trying to figure out a good way of just like making sure I say things and you say things, so I apologize if I'm getting.
Do it.
Yeah, because I think that that's like the other thing that really plays into is like, our government is doing really shitty stuff. It's like right in front of our faces, proving it in terms of certain things going on. Like, look at the detention camps. Look at a lot of like things that we do to our own people, and then you look at like our organizations are corrupt. They're like funneling money in different ways, and so there's like legitimately some shit going on with these different organizations. But is it all this over here? It's kind of like it's more in the middle. Like, you can have both without it being all of a sudden we're going to be in FEMA camps.
And you can be cautious and critical of the government without being racist and anti-Semitic.
Right, exactly. There you go.
Unfortunately, not everybody gets that.
No, yeah. And that's, I think, the biggest reason I think I'm the most critical about conspiracy theories is that it creates this like really strange white supremacist narrative.
Right.
But do you know what the real conspiracy is? Is like the Tuskegee Airmen, Henrietta Lacks, like the fact that we like the experimentations that have happened on like people of color that we discount, but we take that out of the conspiracy narrative because it doesn't fit a white supremacist narrative of supremacy. And so that's kind of like what really frustrates me. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of shit going on, but it's also not exactly what you think is going on.
Yes. Right.
And to be fair, like, I don't know exactly all the things that are going on. I just think that like it's important not to discount certain information just because it doesn't fit into your conspiracy theory.
Right. For example, like I was just blown away to hear about FEMA and the feds confiscating ventilators and test kits.
Yeah.
And there was this whole thing about like state governors having to get underground shipments of ventilators and test kits and hiding it from FEMA so that they wouldn't get it confiscated, wouldn't get it taken.
Yeah, because our government's just taking our shit. Like, see, that's where it's like where we get a little like off the rails, right? Because that is happening.
I'm like, holy crap, why is this happening? What is going on with this? It's this like bizarre. What it comes to is, I feel like it's a combination of sweeping things under the rug to cover up competence, but also this like adversarial kind of thing that's kind of developed between the states and the Fed, which is bizarre. And I've never really seen it like this in my lifetime.
So I need to talk about that actually in terms of like state government versus federal, because there's been like a big divide. And I think it's almost like, is it the right word? Like war of optics or like war of philosophy, is that like we've been fighting for a long time in terms of different camps, right? Like it's like states' rights versus federal rights. And so there's like this big weird tug of war between the two. And then now it's kind of being this weird sort of paradox. I think paradox would be the right word.
Paradoxes.
Is that like we keep saying like it's all about states' rights. And then we're seeing that like the federal government really is important oversight. But then it's being used as like this narrative of like, no, state rights have to do this. But then the federal government is fucking up a lot of states in terms of access to a lot of prepared equipment for the coronavirus.
Right. It's all like a place of ego, right? Like ignorance and arrogance, right?
Yeah.
The Fed.
So like what's really happening, and which I think is going to happen in terms of like what I'm projecting in my weird brain, is that it's really going to become dependent on geographical location in terms of your local and state governments. In terms of what we're doing, because we're really not getting help in a federal way.
No, and not all the states are the same, right? Like every state, every locality, every municipality is going to be impacted differently and is going to be affected differently and has different means and methods in order to combat it. And if I was in a leadership role, I would be delegating as much as possible, because I know that you know your own stuff better than anybody, so take care of it. And if you need help, I'm going to be there to support you with what you need, so tell me what you need. I'm not going to tell you what I want you to do and what I think you need.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think the federal government is like a great checks and balance, because when do you have the mayor of Las Vegas being completely irrational?
Yes. Luckily, yeah. It's kind of the luck of the draw, right? You get a good one or you don't.
Well, and that's the thing. That's like in terms of access, like in terms of masks and ventilators and things like that. It's like right now that's just a necessity. And so
Right.
from a federalist perspective or like our federal government, that's an oversight that they should be figuring out how to happen. States shouldn't be battling each other and being outbid by the federal government for things that are going to save lives on like a very mass level.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
But
It's also kind of this matter of how did a scientific medical issue become so partisan, right?
yeah.
Like if you're, it's just mind-boggling to me.
And I will say on like a smaller scale though, especially in sort of the community I operate in, I am seeing less of that
Mhm.
than what I'm seeing on like the global scale. So it gives me some hope. Like there's people who feel very differently to me politically. Like this does seem to be a point that we can agree on.
Right.
That is hopeful to me. The sad thing is that the reason I think a lot of that happens is because like the loss of like the connection to the loss of life.
Yeah.
And also too, in some ways, like when it comes to like more bodies are vulnerable than others, but the coronavirus doesn't really discriminate, right?
Right. Erased borders, right?
But it's really fascinating that like it's being used as such an intense political platform to divide.
Right.
But we all can agree, well, not necessarily, but one would hope we can all agree that the loss of thousands of individuals.
Right. You would think so, right? But that's only if it impacts you directly, right? It appears to be that there is a certain mentality that only regards it if it impacts them directly, right? And if it doesn't, they can't see it. Their leaders are not taking it seriously, therefore they are not taking it seriously, and feel that their liberties are being infringed upon by being asked to be responsible, right? In case the listeners aren't aware by now, that I just feel like I need to throw this out there. Like I'm an unaffiliated voter and I've never been registered with a political party, but my sympathies are squarely on the left. And I believe in science, I worship nature, and I feel that it's really important to listen to the experts on all of this and really dig into all the research. And that's what we've been doing, with a lot of these theories and unfortunately really politically charged topics that we're talking about today.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good thing to throw out there. And I always kind of want to make sure that we're taking into consideration how sexism and ableism and racism is really playing a big role in all of these components, and how like being really mindful of that and kind of like our positions just like geographically and certain privileges we have just because of our access.
Right.
And it's interesting too, because I think that ties a lot of conspiracy theories together. A lot of times, I think we're all kind of paranoid about being controlled, taken advantage of. And then I think the thing to be mindful of is like, if we're all afraid of that, then don't like pass the buck.
Right.
You know?
Right.
I'm trying to articulate that in a
Well,
better.
I think that's a good point, and I think that kind of segues nicely into, let's talk about some feelings and sentiments towards China, because this is where it all started, as far as, right? And there's a lot of rumors and stuff flying around about where it really came from, right? Was this an engineered virus developed as a bioweapon by China, or was it engineered virus by the FBI or the CIA to go against Trump for not having a pandemic policy or something like that? I've heard some wild, crazy stuff.
So yeah, especially in terms of like, why would one of the most influential global powers
destroy their own economy?
Yeah, like especially if we think of capitalism and the machine it's working on, this doesn't suit anyone. People don't want to shut things down. Like it doesn't suit the purpose of capitalism.
No, it doesn't help anybody.
So, and I think that goes to the fact that like it's really hard, I think, for humans to think that like life is just chaotic and random in many ways. We've been impacting our environment to such a degree that like we're going into different environments. It's also like pandemics are part of human existence in many ways.
Right.
Like, let's go back to the Spanish flu. Let's go back to like cholera, malaria, like Ebola.
That's a good point. A good point to point out the Spanish flu specifically. And for those who don't know, if you haven't been keeping up, the Spanish flu was a global pandemic that hit in 1918, right? And it had similar flu-like symptoms. It affected the lungs, some interesting similarities to the coronavirus. But do you know why it's called the Spanish flu?
Why?
Because they were one of the few countries that acknowledged it first, right?
Yeah.
The whole rest of the world was distracted with like World War I winding down. They were kind of sitting it out, and they were dealing with this flu that wasn't just confined to Spain, had a global effect, but because they were some of the first people to regard it, it ended up being pinned on them.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like with what's going on with China, in a way, it is possible that there were cases outside of China, outside of Wuhan before, but it's probably most likely, as far as all of the research that has been done, it appears that there was legitimately some origins there in Wuhan. And I'd like to dive into that a little deeper, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
Come in with me. So first of all, I'd like to hit on the point of whether or not it could have been engineered in a lab, right?
You know, like, I'm not going to discount the possibility. I think that we're studying viruses all the time. Like I said, my roommate, it works in a place where they're studying typhoid. So he has to be really careful about certain things. Like, we're doing things in many ways to understand how viruses work, how they spread, how they work, how to vaccinate them. But I don't think that that's what happened. Like, I think that's like the least logical conclusion, because I think it fits the whole idea of that really competent, well thought out secret organization thing.
Yeah. That hyper competent, the well-oiled machine that we know is running the world. But actually, there's some science. I found an article from livescience.com that talks about, kind of breaks it down as to really why it's very unlikely that it was not developed, right? First of all, viruses are kind of difficult to engineer, right? And as far as biowarfare, it's a lot easier to take an existing virus and contain it, maybe do some things to it to make it a little more, kind of delivery methods to make it a little more effective. However, in the case with the coronavirus, and this is one of the weird things that makes it so deadly and dangerous, is because when they first started, they designed some computer models about the spread and indicated that this virus is not following the normal models, right? If we're not able to model it accurately as it exists, it's very unlikely that someone would have been someone would have had the foresight and knowledge in order to be able to model it in such a way that we can't model it now, if that makes sense. Right?
Real quick, I want to correct something. It's tuberculosis, not typhoid.
Oh, yeah. Typhoid which tuberculosis was another plague.
I totally agree. And there's been several articles and studies that have come out and have studied that and have been looking into it. Could the concept of the incompetence of the spread and just not noticing it or seeing it fast enough play into it? Sure. Could we have contained it a little bit better with a little bit more oversight? Sure, definitely.
Now, that said, here's my favorite. I found some really interesting stuff. Actually, Savannah, I got to credit Savannah for this one. We found a story, I think it's the New York Times fact checker, talking about how there's some really interesting parallels that exist between the food market, where it's alleged to have started to spread, and these medical labs that were pretty much across the street, right? That were built to contain and study coronaviruses, right? So for everybody listening, if you haven't been fully spun up on, so COVID-19 is a type of coronavirus, which is
Hmm.
the same category as the SARS and the avian flu types of viruses. When those outbreaks occurred, the Chinese government decided it would be a good idea to create research facilities dedicated to studying those types of viruses in order to prevent the spread of similar viruses in the future. Now, both of these laboratories had been under scrutiny and criticism over the past few years about lax safety and security protocols.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, now we have this pandemic erupting out of a region that's within like 5-10 miles. And this is where things get kind of shady, where the government is very quickly pinning the source on like some kind of exotic animals being sold at this food market,
Hmm.
shutting it down when we have these research facilities pretty much across the street from this food market. So it seems plausible, at least, that considering all of the information, that something might have escaped from one of these labs. And
Hmm.
because of the proximity, it was easy to pin it on the food market and then kind of do that save face and contain.
See, and that's like where I think if you were thinking conspiracy theory, that would be more logical.
Yeah,
It's just,
right.
it's a whoopsie. Like, I
Well,
think a lot of our existence are whoopsies more than anything.
right, right. But then again, there's another element of that, like probably, because there's no evidence to support that specifically. Well, the scientists are pointing towards it probably just came out of nature, but
Hmm.
it is suspicious to say the least. That was a factor, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Now, we have to address this other thing when we're talking about conspiracies is the crazy stuff with in California with the guy running the train off the rails to attack the
Yeah, let's talk
USS
about
Mercy.
that. And then we can talk about cults.
Yeah, right. We could talk all night. So
I
basically,
know.
real quick, this dude, his name was Edward Moreno. He's a 44-year-old train engineer from San Pedro, California, under the influence of QAnon.
You should explain what QAnon is real quick because this is
QAnon,
going to be the biggest group that's going to be impacting a lot of stuff in the future.
apparently, a lot of our conspiracy talk is going to be, unfortunately, focusing heavily on QAnon. Basically, they're a group of it's kind of a weird. It's almost like it's like a Twitter movement. Like as far as I understand, it started on Twitter, started on kind of Twitter and like 4chan,
Hmm.
and kind of these. You might even put incels. I think there's probably a lot of like incel QAnon crossovers, but there's weird hippie people that like
Like your
out of nowhere they're
anti-vaxxers who
on
like don't think
QAnon.
through some stuff.
Yeah, right. Weird stuff. Anyway, basically, it's this group. It's an internet following where a group of individuals are claiming that there's this massive satanic and albeit they're when they say Satanism, they are meaning
The devil.
no, they're using Satanism as a code for anti-Semitism, basically,
Oh, that
right?
part I didn't know.
Yeah. That's where
Oh,
it gets
fine. Why
right.
do all of our conspiracy theories involve being racist?
Unfortunately, it's one of those weird things. I use David Icke as an example, right? Like I firmly believe that David Icke is convinced that reptilian shape-shifting aliens, interdimensional beings are controlling the world. I firmly believe that David Icke genuinely believes that. His followers, however, seem to have latched on to that as a code for Jews.
Right. And there's like that problem of like the original source being twisted for.
Yeah, right. So there's a lot of weird conflicting, like within the QAnon material, we'll say.
Mhm.
There's a lot of bizarre, kind of conflicting back and forth, basically all kinds of weird, crazy stuff. But in order to keep up, like the one consistent thing with QAnon is that they view Trump to be some kind of messiah that is there to save the world from the satanic overlords
Lord.
of the world, right? Kind of one world order kind of stuff. So apparently, this guy was under the influence of QAnon and saw his opportunity to run his train off of the rails and destroy the USNS Mercy, which is a hospital ship that was parked in the port of Los Angeles in order to help provide support hospital beds for people that were being treated for coronavirus. Some things came up, a lot of questions as to whether or not it was actually there to help for coronavirus. Apparently, this individual thought that it was there to help launch the zombie apocalypse, apparently, right? And this was all kind of being fed by QAnon. He is being charged in a criminal complaint with one federal count of train wrecking. I'll let that sink in for a minute. There's a law on the books.
That's funny.
A federal law on the books called train wrecking, which is pretty awesome, I think. And I'm glad that it still exists. And he faces a 20-year sentence in federal prison, according to the USDA's office, with no bail. No chance for bail. He was supposed to be arraigned on May 6th, but I haven't been able to catch any updates on that. But I'm definitely interested in keeping well abreast of that information as it develops.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really important discerning about a lot of that kind of thinking popping up. Really being discerning about how a lot of your psychopaths and cult leader mentalities are popping up and taking advantage of this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we want to call a person out because of with our leanings.
Well, we don't necessarily need to be specific because
right. So there's certain people that Jason and I have interacted with that have always have some really good, legitimate, interesting information, but they sprinkle it a lot with a lot of cult leaders do, and they have like really intense followers that.
Oh, unless you're talking about Steven Greer.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can call him right out.
Okay. Well, a couple of things. There's like that pandemic. There's like a viral video that came out by an anti-vaxxer. I haven't watched it because I kind of refused to give that any clicks or likes, spreading out like really intense misinformation. So you have a lot of your anti-vaxxing community, which I almost kind of feel like it's becoming very cult-like. Mm-hmm. In the way it propels propaganda and misinformation, and also has like these really strange intersections that both people, I would say conservative and less leftist thinking, and like hippies and religious people, like they kind of cover the whole gambit of that really odd intersection. Because I kind of went into like a weird deep dive.
Cults can come in so many different shapes and forms, right? And you can look at it like cult mentality or like terrorist organization or religious organization or political organization. There are some blurry lines there.
Yeah. So when I was kind of reading all this, I kind of went into some like really strange deep dive about like comments and things like that. Or even like to go back about this information came out 2 years ago. Why are people suddenly finding it? That's been happening a lot recently, which I find fascinating. Like TED Talks that came out like 2 years ago are suddenly circulating again, you know? And so there's like people are thinking that's a conspiracy. Maybe, who knows?
I think it's just algorithms. Following YouTube, the way our podcast works and stuff, like it's weird. Yeah.
Yeah. So like the algorithms of different things. But anyway, but Steven Greer is like back. I honestly think he's kind of dangerous. He's very charismatic.
Yep. He's legitimately been under investigation, right?
Yeah, he does have interesting information. He is part of like the disclosure stuff. And so it's like one of those weird situations where like you sprinkle in this really interesting truth, but you kind of like twist it in order to have a following. And his stuff is appealing and sexy to a lot of people in terms of like using this as an opportunity for enlightenment, and the aliens are going to come and save us. And
That just makes me shudder. Using sexy and Steven Greer in the same sentences.
I know, but that's what cult leader. There's always a sexual component to it, right?
Yeah, no, true. I mean, he's so full of himself. I'm pretty sure in his talks, he peppers in how much he can bench press.
Right. And so when I say sexy, it's just sort of like that sexy thing, and I mean it more like in like an ephemeral sort of way.
But there
Like,
are people, I know.
right. There's this level of like it's really appealing to that psychology of being saved.
Right.
And it's really important to kind of look at like we have Jim Jones types of cult leaders who's really entrenched in sort of like a more traditional religious sense, but then you have like these new age faux woke.
Yeah. Right. Faux woke. I like that.
Faux woke kind of mentality that's also doing some of the same sort of shady business. And so what I would say is scared and worried in terms of like panic and being irrational is just seeing these things pop up.
Yeah. Right. And before I think it's important, just in case not everybody listening knows who Steven Greer is, we should probably put something out about that, explain it a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Steven Greer is the leader of a group called CSETI, which is like, I forget, Contact for Extraterrestrial Life, some kind of thing. Their whole bit is non-confrontational, kind of like hippy-dippy, meditation-based contact of extraterrestrial intelligences. They have these retreats, and everybody pays, they drop their money, pay to go on this retreat with him and his group and go through these meditations to contact extraterrestrials. There's a lot of weird, kind of sketchy money going to weird places, kind of questioning like him and his ethics and kind of stuff like that. He also launched the Disclosure Project, which was an effort to collect military and government witnesses to go on the record and present their experiences before Congress, which got a lot of attention too. So he's playing on the nuts and bolts documentation kind of crowd.
Yeah, and then he's also kind of like trying to lend himself credibility because he is a doctor.
Yeah, he is a country doctor. He's an MD. And that title gives him credit in a lot of people's eyes because, of course, like, yeah, I mean, he's a doctor. He knows, right?
Which kind of goes back to our things like trust your experts, but then here's an expert that you have to be careful with.
Be a little skeptical on. Yeah, and he uses that, and he, like, if you look at his videos and you look at his material, it sounds like he gets you hooked by saying, like, this sounds really logical, this sounds grounded, this is solid. And then he gets into the deeper side of things, and it's almost kind of like a Messiah way too, because obviously, like, you can't do this on your own. You have to come through him to do it, right? And it does. Like, the people that are following do have. I'm sorry to say it. If you're a CSETI member, there are definitely some cult-like aspects of the way that group operates. So be careful.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's a moment of caution. Like, I think there's a lot of great benefits to meditation and global meditation. Like, I'm the one who's always saying psychoreactive phenomenon, right? So if that's something that I like really put my weight behind, like, I do think that there's some sort of legitimacy to global consciousness, global meditation, working together in a certain sort of way. But it's also, you got to be careful who's using you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like you don't need Steven Greer to do the CSETI protocols. You can meditate, and if you want to try to contact extraterrestrials by psychically or by meditation, then by all means, give it a shot. But be careful who you ask for. I think we should talk briefly about the 5G thing, even though it's completely ridiculous. I'd like to throw it out there and just dispel it right out, because there's a lot of that flying around. 5G is basically a radio signal. There is no evidence to indicate that radio signals of the usable frequency for communication has any health concerns, other than if you're standing next to an HF antenna, you're going to get cooked, but it's not going to trigger a virus.
Right.
Right?
is the most bizarre one of them all, in my opinion. I just feel it's just weird.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, like
it's
radio
fun.
signals and like again that whole like cymatic kind of concept of maybe like having impact on the way we think about something or a subject, but not a virus.
Mm-hmm. Right. And maybe there might be other psychological implications with that as well, and that would be kind of interesting to dive into. But 5G did not create a virus. Just say that right now. As is usually the case, we could go all night with this, but I think we've kind of hit our time quota for this episode.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
I think we chunk into 2.
Yeah, let's give the people something to look forward to with our COVID cryptid corner.
Yeah, and I also would love like make sure that Heather's here too, because I think a lot of the things that she researched and looked up would be really cool to talk about.
Yeah, for sure.
And let that conversation happen, and I'll stop with my cults and my conspiracies.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So with that, we've got a couple of pluggables. Do you have anything to plug?
I've just found so much inspiration for it. I know it's like already a popular podcast, but definitely check out, what is it, Last Podcast on the Left?
Yeah.
I think that they have like a really lovely blend of like, oh my gosh, let's think about this, and go off the rails a little bit, but then also like really heavy research, and I feel it's really well balanced.
Oh yeah, they've got some great stuff.
Especially the JFK one, like it blows my mind. The way it's framed and set up, I think it's just a very helpful piece in terms of kind of contributing to it. And it's allowed me to kind of think about our podcast in certain ways. I really like what we talk about and like what we offer, but I think I just think it's a really good podcast. So I'd plug that. I would also plug donate. Like if you have the means, please donate to who you can in terms of like people who are really working hard. Like my biggest things, like if you can CERC, which helps with like immigration and the detention camps, donate to them, donate to your local food pantry, and then check in on your family and your community and see what they need. Get to know your neighbors. All that stuff.
Nice. Cool. I was just going to talk about shout out to the Pingos at Werewolf Radar, Jordan, Roger, and Nate. Check out their podcast. If you like us, you will like them. And they also make good company for cemetery slumber parties.
They really do. Yeah, it's good. It's pretty solid stuff.
Yeah. So they take a much more comedic approach, right? Their format is more kind of comedy, but they know their stuff, and they put some good information out there. So check them out. Also, just a little mini celebration for us is CSS podcast is now on Pandora.
Yay! That's awesome.
So if you're listening to Pandora, you can check us out over there. And pretty much we're on every platform that I can think of besides iTunes. But you can get, if you're listening on Apple devices, you can get the podcast on Castbox. Also, real quick little one, I was interviewed for a book about underground, kind of regarding our investigations in the Tivoli and the catacombs underneath the Tivoli. And it was a book focusing on underground mining towns, Colorado.
Where we're going to milk the Tivoli for years, aren't we?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We'll never live. Yeah. The Tivoli is kind of a legacy for us. But that's cool. I'm not sure when that's going to be coming out, but keep an eye out for it. I'll keep you posted and let you know.
I don't know if you did this on the last podcast, but did you talk about the paper that you got published?
No, because it's not really relevant to cryptoscience.
Yeah, but it's still astronomy stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty lights in the sky. So, like, yeah, archaeoastronomy, I published a paper on basically Mesoamerican calendar, computer modeling, and polar star precession.
All that stuff fits because you use that a lot in your paranormal research. So go read it. Sure. It's a good piece.
Yeah. So it's kind of cool. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for celebrating all the little things. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Podcast was written and produced by the Crypto Science Society and its members. The theme music is Dead Bats on a Wire by Savannah Rivka and Ashley Eve. Graphic design by Eddie Norrie and Heather Metcalf. If you like what we do, please consider donating to our Venmo by following the link on our homepage, which is sciencecryptojournal.wordpress.com. You can also find the blog, our source reports, all kinds of exciting stuff about our investigations and everything we do. More information about the podcast there. So go check it out. Let us know what you think in the comments or email us at cryptosciencesocietyx@gmail.com. Follow us on all the socials. That's the Twits, the Grams, Facebooks, YouTubes. You know how it works. Like, subscribe, share, and until next time, keep questioning.
Nice.